So we start with presentation by Mikhail Minakov from Kennan Institute, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The title of his presentation is 30 Years of Democratization in Ukraine. So, Mikhail?
Yes, thank you, Svitlana. Thank you very much to all organizers for making this seminar. And in my report, I will try to probe the principle that in the first half of the seminar we discussed, the principle that polarization about fundamental issues can undermine democracy or can undermine democratization. And I will test this idea probably on the case of Ukrainian demodernization. And that's a specific situation. So this principle probably does not feel entirely to the Ukrainian case, because here we also take into account the strength of state institutions. So in many cases, in many cases, this polarization in liberal democracies, in developed liberal democracies, can be overcome due to legal order, due to political system. So the living liberal democracies show examples of overcoming even very harsh polarizations. And the case of United States right now shows just another attempt of doing it. But in Ukrainian case, we have a little bit different story. And here I start with our story. So democratization of Ukraine started around 30 years ago. It's connected with the late Soviet Union and dissolution of Soviet Union. If you look at this chart that is based on the liberal democracy index measured in the system of varieties of democracy in the data set 9, you can see that basically the rise of democracy in Ukrainian case is connected with late Soviet Union. The first rise, it's 1990, and then the independence period that starts in the end of 1991. Also, this blue line shows the average for the Eastern Europe and Central Asia in terms of liberal democratization. And you see this jump on the graph. However, Ukraine does not follow entirely this median line, but shows several jumps, several rises of liberal democracy, first connected with the post-Soviet period, perestroika and post-perestroika periods, then long decline connected to the socioeconomic crisis, then rise connected with the Orange Revolution, and then minimal rise in times of Euromaidan. And here I will try to understand why was it happening. So my major theses are that, first of all, there is a common destiny of democratization and Ukraine as independent state. So Ukraine state independence is part of the third wave of democratization. And probably this common destiny is also connected with the decline of democracies, the rise of autocracies that we witness today in recent 10 to 15 years. And that means that there's also a growing risks and threats for the statehood. There's also an overlap of Europeanization and democratization in Ukraine. So our democracy model, liberal democracy, is connected with the idea of liberal democracy in EU and United States to a smaller extent. Then Ukrainian political development was much more diverse than democratization only. Although this graph shows us a lot about the story, the political development was also connected with neo-patrimonial politics, competitive autocracy periods, and existence of hybrid state or hybrid regimes that were oscillating with less freedom or more freedom, but never bringing Ukraine to at least inefficient or deficient democracy in terms of either economist intelligence unit or in the terms of Freedom House. Finally, I would like my final thesis is that Ukraine never reached this full-fledged democracy status in none of the three elements, although one of the three elements of democracy, so liberal democracy, participatory democracy, and electoral democracy, although electoral democracy element is best developed in Ukraine. So basically this graph can be described as 6 periods. The first one is connected with the existence of post-Stalinist authoritarian Soviet Ukraine that developed pretty well and in social terms, in industrial terms, in urbanization terms, and reached the period of perestroika between 88 and 91. Although in Moscow, perestroika started already by end of 85, in Ukraine, it really reached Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, by 88, and the real practice of perestroika goes outside of Kyiv in 89, 90. Then there's a period, the first post-Soviet revolution, the first experimentation with statehood, with democracy. It's a relatively short period of fast and comprehensive democratization connected to real decommunization. So the KGB is dismissed, Communist Party of Soviet Union is dissolved. Sorry, colleagues, someone didn't switch off his or her microphone. Could you please do it? Thank you. So the real decommunization was happening at this period. Then we have a period of establishment of national sovereign state. It was also a slow process. It's mainly connected with the referendum on independence in December 1991, and then 92, 93, the period of establishment of the sovereign state. And of course, creation of ideological pluralism that is rooted in perestroika, but flourishes already in 1990, 1993. And then approximately around 97 to 2004, before the first color revolution in Ukraine, before the first Maidan, there was a stable democratic decline and establishment of hybrid oligarchic system. When you have a democratic facade constructed out of official institutes, state institutes, political institutes, and very strong clan networks, informal groups that are united around oligarchic figures and that undermine efficiency of government of any kind, either democratic or autocratic periods in Ukrainian history. Then around 2004, the number of contradictions in new political system reached the level when the color revolution started, which was connected with dishonest elections, and elections were the major democratic institute that functioned in Ukraine. And this outrage that provoked some mass manifestations and mass protests have forced the elites to actually follow the demands of the street, although in terms of democracy, it might not be really the democratic institution, the role of the street. However, it brought, in terms of at least liberal and electoral democracy, a rise in Ukraine, return of freedoms, more competition in political terms. And then another decline, democratic decline, approximately around 2008, 2009, and then the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych, who was, we will talk about it later, but the period of decline of political freedom very strong. And then since 2014, this final stage in Ukrainian democratization that is connected with democratic attempt of the first phase of Euromaidan protests. And then there was a period, a contradictory period connected with the war, with reforms, with European association, and with a populist reaction to this in 2019. So basically, if we look at the participatory component index, and here I show also, I compare with the neighbors of Ukraine, you can see that Ukraine, in terms of participation of citizens in decision-making in 21st century was pretty high. It grew after the Orange Revolution and somewhat dropped down by this, in times of Yanukovych rule. It rose again with the reforms, the post-Euromaidan reforms, and it was slowly declining during the dominance of Poroshenko clan. However, you can see that it's mainly Moldova that is following the same pattern, very close to Ukrainian. And after the Rose Revolution in Georgia, there was a permanent growth of participatory component of democracy. And here you can see that Belarus and Russia were had less participatory component index. However, it's this most developed democratic institute for these two autocratic systems. If you look at the liberal component, the difference between more free and less free 5 countries are more visible. Here you can see deviation of Russia, stable drop in terms of liberal democracy, very stable non-democratic situation in Belarus, and the competition between Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine in these liberal terms. And finally, electoral democracy index also shows this difference between the group of 3, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and Russia and Belarus. Well, here we have enough data to say that Belarus and Russia have stably lost their democratic quality of politics. However, they were still trying to involve citizens in decision-making, mainly at local councils, at those political bodies that have the least role in distribution of power and resources. Well, in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, we have unstable political systems with hybrid regimes, where regimes oscillate between their semi-free and less free statuses. Ukraine's democratic betterment was mainly connected with civic mass protests, directly connected with the Orange Revolution and partially with Euromaidan in 2013-14. However, it's also supported by the case of Ukraine that political change achieved by democratic movements, by protests, did not lead to institutionalization of political freedom. And that's very important. Every time there is a period for about a year or 2 years when elites remember the fear before the street and they are open for a certain level of reforms, but then quite soon these reforms are used for redistribution of power and increase of power by clans. So this latest period in Ukraine is probably most interesting in terms of this polarization and fundamental contradictions in regard with the fundamental interests of the society. So this post-Maidan and the Maidan and post-Maidan period starts with pretty bad situation. During Yanukovych presidency, there was an illegitimate return of presidential parliamentary system that existed before 2006, and for a long time, it was not the power of presidents. This growing role of presidents was done not through democratic process, but through questionable decision of constitutional court. And this has actually provided the president with much more authority that he was elected to in 2010. Then there was real dominance of the party of power, this party of the regions, which was reached, this dominance was reached through democratic institutes and in legislature and in executive and in local councils. So by the end of 2010, 5 clans that were controlling the party of regions basically controlled the parliament, the executive, and 90% of local councils in Ukraine. And finally, then in 2012, there was a... Excuse me? There was a question? Well, authoritarian... Sorry, I do not know if you...
I muted everybody, so they don't interrupt you. So Mikhail, can you switch on your mic back? Mikhail, can you switch your mic back?
Okay, colleagues. Now, do you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Very good. So, and then there's a period in the end of 2012 when after parliamentary elections, there's one clan out of all party of regions clan that starts consolidating autocratic power in their hands, attempting to construct a monopyramid system, mainly modeled by what was happening either in Belarus or in Russia. And these stronger contradictions between different clans coincided with growing contradictions between 2 regional projects, European and Eurasian, that added to the internal dynamics in Ukraine and started this huge political crisis that ends up with the change of Yanukovych regime, his runaway, change of government that in the way that is not foreseen by Ukrainian constitution, and the start of the secessionist movements. So in February 2014, Ukraine turns out to be in a very difficult situation. So this post-Maidan period where we test this concept of contradictions has 3 periods. First, revolutionary period, where one group or agglomerate of several groups, liberals, nationalists, and the clans, the pro-Maidan clans, they come together in order to re-legitimize the political system. The change of government was done in the way that does not correlate with Ukrainian legislation or constitution. So it was a smart and intelligent move to re-legitimize Ukraine. However, it was done in a way when already several political parties by political pressure were dissolved or marginalized. and only some political groups could participate in elections. Also, the role of the oligarchs was growing in order to diminish polarization. If you look at those drops of information, of reliable information about the meeting of the oligarchs in Vienna in March 2014, you can see that basically they understood that this polarization can destroy the country and fragmentize it. So they were looking for a person who could bring together different ideological, social, ethnic, ethnolingual groups together and to restart internal consolidation after the crisis in February. And such figure was found in this rising star of oligarchy, Petro Poroshenko, who won in the May elections, also due to this involvement of the oligarchs who dismissed the funding for alternative candidates. In the fall of 2014, there was also parliamentary elections. But between the elections in May, the presidential elections, and October parliamentary elections, the fully fledged war started in Ukraine. And this war was connected with local actors who are the secessionist or irredentist movements, and with the aggression of Russia that annexed Crimea and supported two breakaway territories in Donbass. And in this period, the opportunity of democracy or democratic reform was very vulnerable because of the war. So we have a situation with two agendas in this period. A revolutionary agenda of liberal democracy connected to the political part of EU-Ukraine association agreement, and the war agenda that needs more disciplined society, controlled mass media, patriotic movement, and concentration of power in the hands of government in order to be able to fight back the aggression. But in 2015, the major events of the war are ending in March 2015, and we have this slow-level military conflict. And that was the period when consolidation was not important anymore. And this is when the coalition that was connected around this war agenda started slowly dissolving into groups with very different interests, which have led to the sacking of this prime minister that was an honest broker between different oligarchic clans, and one clan structure came to power. And here in this situation, we have an attempt of non-democratic consolidation. Again, the war situation remains. Ukrainian government does not control all the internationally recognized territory. And of course, there's a strong movement towards more war-related patriotism and the figure of the chief commander, which used this momentum for non-democratic and non-constitutional consolidation in the hands of one clan and associates. Consolidation was still limited, as there were many opposition groups and other clans like Arsenov, the Minister of Interior clan, was outside of the power of the consolidated power, so that created informal checks and balances system. There was a growing role of ideology, of nationalist ideology and conservative ideologies. However, the role of clans was still visible. Here you can see the graph produced by the World Bank showing the politically connected the role of politically connected companies. In the previous period, where corruption was mainly associated with the turnover, so companies that were related to presidents and ministers controlled approximately 20 to 23% of assets, and approximately 26%, 24 to 26% of turnover. In 2013-14, we have economic crisis, which drops down the turnover. But you can see that control of assets was growing unprecedentedly exactly after Euromaidan. That was expected to deliver anti-corruption and the fight of the corruption. So basically the ideology, these illusions of fight with the corruption and the real result impact was already seen in 2015. And it was also connected with the idea of the national patriotic forces that they create the majority. They speak on behalf of this ethno-lingual cultural group in their imagination that will support their case in Ukraine. However, it was not the case, and in 2019 presidential elections, suddenly a figure outside of politics becomes the president. The showman, comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky becomes a figure that brings together over 70% of voters, and his voters were divided approximately 57 to 41. 57 supported this candidate as a new face, as a person that was not participating in politics before, and 40% were motivated by the vote against Poroshenko and this image of the majority, of ethno-lingual cultural majority. And then we have a situation when our parliaments start changing their members very much. So we have, in the last elections, have 80% of new MPs.
Excuse me, Mikhail, of 2 minutes left.
Ну, давайте.
Извините, что случилось?
Mikhail, 2 minutes left.
Yes, sure.
For your presentation. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yes, sure. And there's 80% of Ukrainian population of Ukrainian parliament that was absolutely new. So in a way, in 2019, we have the rise of populist ideas how to reconstruct democracy in Ukraine. And this democracy was traumatized by the idea of this ethno-lingual cultural majority, but also did not have any positive message. So it was rather reactionary populist decision. So to summarize, I would say that in Ukraine, we see growing polarization on fundamental issues on what is the people, what is the demos, what are the citizenship rights, how the state should exist. At the same time, the autocratic and democratic tendencies are equally failing, since government is quite inefficient and the role of informal politics is so big, elections do not really make the final decision. Citizens, by voting, by participating in a limited way in decision-making, still do not have a say. So autocratic tendencies exist, but they all constantly fail. There are, though, strong illiberal tendencies that exist and influence political and legal practice. And we also see that in Ukraine, there's emergence of new generation of dissidents, something that we didn't have since 1980s, since Soviet Union. Elections still remain formally competitive. It's also the area of informal competition, but the role of law in these competitions is minimal. Also, the parties in these conditions are very weak, and they are personalized, and they permanently reshuffle their members in the parliament, so there's no gathering of experience and knowledge. And the role of war and secession reactions to secessionism and irredentism is very strong, which leads to securitization of politics. So this bigger role of security services in discussion, in public debate. So to close my argument, I would say that the case of Ukraine, neither liberal democracy nor competitive authoritarianism or attempts of competitive authoritarianism are stable. So this phenomenon of polarization about fundamental issues can actually prevent from everything, from liberal democratization, from authoritarianization, and keeps the entire state and political system and political regime at the minimum of existence, but for a long term, and there's a vibrance of this situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhail, for very interesting and actual presentation. In the previous section, we had the question about the main challenges to democracy in developing countries. And I suppose the presentation by Mikhail Minakov contributes to this issue, at least partly. Well, I ask all the participants to mute their microphones except of the speaker, okay? During the presentation. Professor Bowling, have you joined us already? No. Well, we hope he will come soon. And now, please start with the presentation by Tinatin Bochorishvili from Scientific Research Institute, University of Georgia. The title of her presentation is Contemporary Challenges of Democracy in Georgia. Please.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Good afternoon. So I guess sharing my screen is successful. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to attend this online conference. I'm sorry I was late during opening of the conference because of electricity. I don't know what happened, but in around 40 minutes it came. So I joined this conference in time, but then I had to quit it. So anyhow, for those who don't know me, my name is Tina Bochorishvili, professor of philosophy at University of Georgia, and I've been teaching philosophy for almost 40 years. And I wish to express my deep appreciation and thanks to Dr. Yapping, whom I know since, I don't know, very long time from Father George MacLean, who prominent person and outstanding philosopher whom I miss very much. We Georgian philosophers are very obliged to him, and actually, he was a pioneer of Georgian American scientific contacts more than 30 years ago, and special thanks to dearest Yapping, who successfully continues his work for dedication and commitment towards the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy. So the subject of my talk is contemporary challenges of democracy in Georgia. I'm not a politician, but as a citizen, I'm deeply concerned with ongoing political crises in my country. Sorry. When I talk about the crisis, I realize that actually all my life I hear about political crisis. For the last 30 years, crisis are our everyday life. So for those who don't know, well, most of you know, but still from geopolitical view, so Georgia is located between Russia, Black Sea, Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. It's one of the most ancient countries in the world, and currently 20%, 1/5 of territory of Georgia, which is less than 70,000 square kilometers, is occupied by Russia, is under control of Russia. So Georgia's population is less than 4 million people, and religion, Orthodox Church, was founded in the 4th century, and Georgian language is more than 2,000. So you know, most of you know about Georgia. Just I wanted to show that it's surrounded by different countries, and first of all, it's located between Russia and Turkey, and their rivalry for centuries is not a surprise. So Georgia has possessed historical continuity of statehood since ancient times, and we had invasions by several empires such as Rome, Persia, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, the last one, and so on. So it's located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. And people often ask, Georgia is in Europe or in Asia? One definition of Europe marks the Caucasus Mountain as its border, putting Georgia firmly in Asia. Other definitions place the whole Caucasus region, including Georgia, in Europe, which is where most Georgians feel it belongs, and most Georgians enthusiastically think of being more European, and being European as a positive attribute. 103 years ago, Georgia's first prime minister tried to accentuate the identity of the Georgian state. And quotation, Europe or Asia is the question we are facing, and I hereby repeat even louder, we choose Europe, European democracy. So what does it mean to Georgian society to be European? Does this mean an embrace of social agenda and values of Western Europeans? Is Europe merely seen as a protector of Georgian security, a counterweight to Russia or Turkey? Georgians answer to this question, yes, as we seek to establish a special place for ourselves on the margins of Europe. I am Georgian and therefore I am European. Speaker of the Georgian parliament uttered this phrase in a speech marking Georgia's accession to the Council of Europe. Georgia is meant to be part of Europe, and the country is engaged in political project of Euro-Atlantic integration. This phrase was intended to convey both a desire and a confirmation of reality. Ever since then, the phrase has allowed for a broad interpretation of Georgians' identity. So we Georgians identify ourselves as Europeans and want to see our country become a member of the European Union. 30 years after Georgia gained independence, it is worth asking whether the country's struggle for independence is finished. Is it over? As long as we Georgians see our struggle for independence as continuing, that question remains unanswered. It reminds me one anecdote which goes as follows. So you can see this. It's an old Georgian anecdote. So two Georgian mountain climbers ascending the highest peak in the Caucasian mountain range, and after climbing up a sheer rock, face up into the clouds for many, many hours. One of the two loses his grip and falls off, and his friend calls out to him and says, Tengiz, Tengiz, can you hear me? And Tengiz replies, I can hear you fine. Well, the interrogation begins. Tengiz, are your legs broken? No, says Tengiz, my legs seem to be okay. How about your arms? No problem there. How about your back? Seems fine. This interrogation goes on for some time, and Tengiz' friend, who is clinging to the rock, finally calls out in frustration and says, Tengiz, you seem to be in a better shape than I am. Why don't you climb back up here? To which the voice of Tengiz comes through the clouds. But I am still falling. So 30 years from the end of the Soviet Union and the restoration of the independence of my country, we feel like Tengiz in a free fall. In the chaotic aftermath of the Russian Revolution in 1917, Georgia, which was annexed by the Russian Empire since the early 19th century, declared itself an independent democratic republic on May 26, 1918. So you can see here the Declaration of Independence and the founding fathers of First Georgian Republic. But this republic lasted only for 3 years after being invaded in 1921 by the Russian Red Army. You can see here this old picture, Russian Red Army. So they marched in Tbilisi after days of heavy battles around the Georgian capital, marking the onset of 70-year Soviet occupation. Exactly 100 years ago, Democratic Republic of Georgia fell to the invading Russian army, and the country became one of the Soviet republics. We remember the Soviet Union. So Georgians never gave up their fight for independence, and the country restored its independence from the Soviet Union on April 9, 1999, and was admitted to the United Nations. Proclaiming independence in 1991, Georgian leaders referred to the 1918 Independence Act, which had brought to life the short-lived First Republic, Georgian Democratic Republic, multi-party independent state being crushed by the Bolshevik Red Army. The key foundational event leading up to Georgia's modern independence was a tragedy on April 9, 1989, when Soviet troops brutally suppressed a peaceful demonstration in Tbilisi and killed 21 people. This tragic event discredited the Communist Party of Georgia and propelled the nationalist opposition to power in Georgia's first 3 elections. So this tragic event paved the way to independence for Georgia. Massacre was a sacrifice, and people died for independence and freedom. So Georgians perceive April 9 tragedy as a sacrifice for the country's independence. If you look at the picture, and these pictures are from the book dedicated to 9 April. So this is me with my students here on the demonstration. Of course, I was not there when this massacre happened because I had 2 small kids at that time. I was at home. And the next picture, you can see tanks, and this is in front of Institute for Philosophy, and somewhere in the background next to the white car, I discovered myself. Well, so there was Commandant Hour and so on and so forth. This was tragic event, and this next picture is soldiers in front of State University, Tbilisi State University. This is next morning after the tragedy, and still, of course, it's not me this time. So these tragic events, after these tragic events, Georgia's first president became Gamsakhudia, prominent dissident, jailed by Russian Soviet authorities in the late Soviet period. Gamsakhudia's brief period as country's leader is associated with chaos and conflict. He had imprisoned several of his opponents and as a fierce ethnic nationalist. helped to trigger conflict in the autonomous regions of South Ossetia and afterwards in Abkhazia. So hundreds died and were displaced during this conflict. And the causes of the conflict are complex, but one of them is undoubtedly the discourse propagated by Gamsakurdia and others that Ossetians were guests on Georgian soil and deserved fewer rights than ethnic Georgians. They advocated complete independence from the Soviet Union and popularized the slogan, Georgia for Georgians. In December 1991, Gamsakurdia was violently overthrown by his opponents and dozens of people died in the center of Tbilisi. And Gamsakurdia fled Georgia and returned. So this was another civil war in nearest history of Georgia. I want to say a couple of words about three leaders afterwards, leaders of and presidents of Georgia, Eduard Shevardnadze, Mikhail Saakashvili, and Bidzina Ivanishvili. Just a couple of words. Georgia's two main leaders, Saakashvili and Ivanishvili, have partly rehabilitated Gamsakurdia, first president, and Saakashvili had Gamsakurdia's remains transferred back to Georgia and reburied at the Tatsminda Pantheon. Gamsakurdia was also posthumously awarded the title of national hero, and Saakashvili praised the former president while stressing that he, unlike Gamsakurdia, believed in Georgia as a multi-ethnic society. So if the goal of the national movement in the early 90s was to restore independence, in modern times, the narrative is that there is still a danger of Georgia losing its independence. So the overriding goal is to preserve it. 3 decades of independence have also linked the country's historical narrative and state policies with the actors of individual political leaders. Each of Georgia's post-Soviet leaders has come to power in opposition to the previous one. Each of these 3 reaffirmed a commitment to democracy and a pro-Western foreign policy, as each leader came to power pledging to overcome a political and economic crisis. He mobilized the public by declaring a sharp break with his predecessor. In contrast to some other post-Soviet nations, the public in Georgia perceives the state and its political leader as different from each other. Even if the leader lacks full legitimacy, the state continues to move in the right historical direction. The perception is that the state is pursuing a long journey through history, while the leader is a temporary figure. So Shevardnadze, he was former leader of the Communist Party of Georgia and then Soviet foreign minister under Mikhail Gorbachev, returned to his country as de facto leader in 1992, and he was elected first president in 1995 and served until he resigned under pressure in 2003. Shevardnadze's era as leader was crowded with events: the signing of Russian dictate peace agreement with South Ossetia, a civil war in Western Georgia, outbreak of war in Abkhazia, economic troubles, etc. Independent Georgia has made substantial democratic progress aided by multi-party elections, robust civil society organizations, and media freedoms. In 2003, the Rose Revolution, one of the first color revolutions, a peaceful uprising against political stagnation, accelerated democratic momentum. From 2003 to 2012, with President Saakashvili, a new phase of state building had begun with several key themes emerged in Georgia's memory politics. An attempt to construct new identities using symbols, reinterpretation of some historical events, fighting crime and corruption, achieving economic growth, etc., while faulting it for human rights violations and and inability to avoid the 2008 war with Russia. Georgia experienced another big disjunction in 2012 when Saakashvili's party lost power to the Georgian Dream coalition led by Georgia's richest man, Ivanishvili, who then became prime minister. Georgian Dream won 2016 and 2020 elections. The biggest failure of the Georgian Dream government is a weak economic growth. So current political crisis started, the last political crisis started in 2019 when a member of Georgia's ruling party invited a Russian lawmaker, Sergei Gavrilov, to preside over a meeting inside Georgia's parliament. Tensions flared when Sergei Gavrilov, a member of Russia's Duma, sat in the parliamentary speaker's chair, you can see him here sitting, to address an international gathering of lawmakers, some kind of interparliamentary assembly who were meeting in Tbilisi. During a break, members of Georgia's main opposition parties marched in and occupied the speaker's podium. You can see it on the next picture. So questions were, where is Gavrilov? Where is the occupier? Show him to me. And Elena Fostaria, one of, you can see her here, she was draped in the Georgian national flag. She walked up to the podium and tore Gavrilov's speech to pieces. So today, the members of parliament, they shouted, they will defend the parliament hall from the Russian occupiers. And this meeting will not continue until Russian delegation leaves the chamber. Tbilisi views Russia as an occupier since the 2008 war with Russia and Moscow's recognition of breakaway Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Gavrilov voted for Russia to recognize the territories as independent. Earlier in the day, Ukraine's ambassador to Georgia, Igor, walked out of another meeting when Gavrilov began his address. I don't want to listen to the Russian Federation, which occupied Georgian and Ukrainian territories, Dolhov said. So Georgian opposition groups are accusing the ruling Georgian Dream Party of selling out to Moscow by inviting the assembly to hold its annual meeting in Tbilisi. The Georgian Dream brought in the occupiers and put them in the parliamentary speaker's seat, Fostaria said, and by doing this, Georgian Dream slapped all of the Georgia's history in the face. So despite the fact that some Georgian Dream members tried to calm tension by saying that they were also disturbed to see a Russian deputy preside over a meeting inside Georgia's parliament, and this is quotation from them that Russia is a country that occupies 20% of our territory, and it was disturbing to see a representative of that country's parliament in the chair of the Georgian parliamentary speaker. So also Bidzina Ivanishvili, the Georgian Dream chairman, he also said that it was unacceptable to have a Russian government representative preside over any forum in the Georgian parliament. But still, the protests ballooned, and thousands, I can show it to you, so thousands blocked the main avenue outside parliament, while protesters also reportedly gathered in other cities, and they declared that step by step, using soft power, the Georgian Dream want us to accept that diplomatic relations with Russia can be restored, that it is possible to have friendship with Russia, and so on and so forth. So, booed by the protesters, Gavrilov left the country and warned that Georgia will face consequences for that incident. So, Interior Ministry forced to use disappropriation force, including rubber bullets against anti-government protesters, partially blinding too. More than 100 participants were hospitalized. The police brutal dispersal of demonstration resulted in more rallies and demands for the prime minister to resign, and Then, in an attempt to calm the unrest, Georgian Dream chairman Bidzina Ivanishvili promised to hold the 2020 parliamentary elections with a system of proportional representation, something that reformers had long pushed as a means of weakening the ruling party's grip on power. However, Georgian Dream then failed to adopt constitutional amendments to introduce a fully proportional electoral system. And crisis reached a new pitch when opposition parties refused to recognize the results of the 2020 parliamentary elections, which they said were rigged. The opposition's boycott was accompanied by street protests demanding new elections, and the victorious Georgian Dream refused to cede. The tensions increased after government's decision to detain party's leader, United National Movement's leader Melia, and Melia's detention followed the controversial return of a new prime minister after previous one left the post, unhappy with the plan to detain Melia. That was the final straw that caused Western powers to see the need for more committed intervention. This is when senior European and US diplomats emerged as brokers in the political crisis, and the European Union's response to the political crisis in Georgia has been remarkable and impressive on several levels. The Union moved quickly to offer itself as a mediator. European Council's President, Charles Michel, visited the country and offered the EU's help, shaped around the six-point plan that envisaged ambitious electoral and judiciary reforms, a solution to the issues of alleged political prisoners, the possibility of new elections and power sharing in the parliament. So, in recent months, the EU has engaged at a high level in Georgia's political crisis. It has demonstrated that it is strongly invested in Georgia and sees the country's democratization as a matter of strategic importance for European interests. The EU's intervention has been shaped around the process of mediation between the ruling and opposition political parties, as the bitterness of their rivalry risks a major unraveling of the country's democratic reforms. Also, the EU's engagement entails many positive elements. The Union will now need to move beyond mediation and ally this to be a careful use of democratic leverage to ensure that necessary reforms are implemented in Georgia. Otherwise, the breakthrough is brokered will remain shallow, and another political crisis can erupt. So, in this year, in 2021, Georgia is marked in a deep domestic political crisis following disputes over the 2020 parliamentary elections. Many citizens are weary of the protracted crisis between the government and the opposition, and as external actors from the West take the lead in mediating the domestic conflict, many are wondering whether the Georgian government rigid behavior could lead the country off a Euro-Atlantic path. So nowadays, Georgia's status as a post-Soviet democratic leader is under challenge. A flawed presidential election, use of force against protesters, and political manipulations by the secretive billionaire who heads the ruling Georgian Dream Party have strained public confidence and brought mounting public protests. Here I can show you the map. And so today, almost 3 decades from gaining independence, we again are tired of poor governance and lack of transparency. A National Democratic Institute poll found last year that 60% of representatives evaluate the performance of the current government as bad. We Georgians generally conceive of our 30-year history of independence. Yes.
Excuse
How many
me,
minutes
2
do I
minutes
have?
left. 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
And are your slides supposed to change?
Yes, I need just a few minutes, and
Okay.
that's it. So, Georgia faces serious risks. Russian irredency in Ukraine raises the prospect that Moscow may do more to undermine Georgia. Poverty erodes social committee and national strength. To reduce vulnerabilities, Georgia needs a more vibrant political systems and replacing a leader. Our experience has proved without altering policy only temporarily is the situation, and in the longer run fosters a sense of frustration and polarization in society. So Georgia's modern history has a strong focus on the struggle for freedom and independence and preservation of independence. We Georgians see our country as an established democracy, yet 30 years or the mainstream historical narrative still portrays the country as vulnerable and facing existential threats to its statehood. We are proud of the path our country has taken since independence and believe it to be a democracy. Despite civil wars, political and economic crises, since independence, Georgia has more successes than failures. Negative events are valued and perceived as a sacrifice to achieve the greater historical goal of restoring statehood. So, wedged in a troubled region, Georgia stands out as an emerging democracy. Also, Middle East and Russia-Ukraine crisis loom large. Western leaders cannot forget Georgia. It needs their support to deter risks and advance progress. Joining the European Union and NATO are among the country's top foreign policies. Foreign policy goals. So that concludes my talk for today. I'd like to thank you for taking time and listening to my presentation here. Georgian children, our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very so much for your presentation. We can see some parallels between Ukraine and Georgia and their fate as a part of Russian Empire and Soviet Union. And both countries had the armed conflict with Russia and faced the Russian-baked irredentism, and the presence of such a neighbor as Russia had a great influence obviously on democratic development of both countries. And I hope we can discuss this issue in the end. Well, I gave both presenters 5 minutes more because we have delayed our start in 5 minutes. And now Professor Bowring is with us. Are you here, Professor Bowring? Do you listen? Do you hear me? Unfortunately, he had problems with his internet connection. It's a pity. Hope we will have a chance to listen to his presentation. And now, while I have no choice, our next presenter will be Grivas Kayange from Department of Philosophy, Chancellor College, University of Malawi. The title of his presentation is African Neoliberal Democracy and the Collapse of the Corporation. So please, Professor. We don't hear you, Professor Kayange. We can see your presentation. Hello. Oh, now we.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Let's start. Okay.
Okay, so can I start my presentation? Hello.
Sure. Yeah, this screen is yours. You can start now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you
can
very
see
much.
your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm presenting on the liberal democracy and the collapse of the African cooperation. I've chosen the notion of cooperation because this one is regarded as the highest form of production in the context of capitalism, which is linked with the notion of democracy because of the idea of liberty that is fundamental in capitalism. This is why I've chosen this cooperation, because it can help us see well what is happening in some of these African nations, but more specifically what is happening in Malawi. So I will start my presentation by indicating that I will first present the notion of democracy here, but my main concern will be the political system. So what the government is running and what is happening on the ground. So I will identify what I will call democratic socialism. Then I will also identify neoliberalism. So democratic socialism will be from 1964 up to 1994, when we had the multi-party democracy coming in. Of course, the neoliberal democracy started around in 1980 due to a number of issues. So that's what I will present, and I will demonstrate the status of the cooperation, the African cooperation in all this. So immediately I'll go to the notion of democracy in Malawi. I argue that Malawi's democracy, as I indicated earlier, is classifiable in two, where we can talk about the democratic socialism, and then we can talk about neoliberal democracy. So democratic socialism puts together socialism and liberalism. I think we are probably all aware that this is coming mainly from the French philosophy in 1848, when they were trying to put together monarchism and also trying to introduce liberalism. So this ended up with this notion of democratic socialism, which is some of the philosophers such as Hayek, Road to Serfdom, in his work, Road to Serfdom, was not really comfortable with this combination. Of course, he was also referring to Tocqueville, that it's really a bad condition, a bad combination, because I will just quote what they were saying, that democracy extends the sphere of individual freedom, socialism restricts it. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man. Socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. So it seems it's a contradiction to say that Malawi was indeed endorsing this type of democracy, but I will underline that this best describes the events, how they started since 1964 up to 1994. Now, I will quickly indicate that there are arguments that the democratic socialism can be traced even in African communitarianism, where we are taking traditional African communitarianism, adding it with the element of individual freedom or ownership of property and so on. Now, this one here is argued mainly by philosophers who defend the notion of Ubuntu, which is practically about putting the human person, the community, at the center of everything. So you understand everything, even in the individual, through the community. So there it is argued that it's something natural in African context to hold this communitarianism. Of course, there are other philosophers such as Wamala, who was studying the Baganda people of Uganda, also argued in similar lines that we have this element where we have communitarianism, but we are infusing also some elements of democracy, such as the issues of participation, consensus, legitimization of leaders, but also the element of individual ownership of property. So coming back to our context here in Malawi, we have presidents such as Kamuzu Banda, who argued also for this democracy, where he's saying that our people, that in their traditional context, they had a certain form of democracy. And he was arguing that him being a capitalist, he wanted at least to embrace elements that are coming from there. And after all, he was arguing that his government is coming from the idea of the will of the people, that the people decided, for example, to have him as a president, to have his party as the only party ruling Malawi. So this very idea, which is sometimes linked to the traditional context and sometimes linked to the ideas that are coming from liberalism, this became fundamental in the period of Kamuzu. I think most of the people, they know the first president of Malawi, Kamuzu Banda, they know him as a dictator, and the system from 1964 to 1994, many they see it as dictatorial. But you will all see also that studying it from the angle of the corporations, there is indeed this strong presence of democratic socialism that is somehow being manipulated also by different individuals in order to get what really they wanted. So that's my background about democratic socialism. I just want to note a point that after Kamuzu Banda, we can also trace democratic socialism in another president who started ruling around 2005 up to 2012. This was Bingwa Mutharika. He was trying to bring back democratic socialism. But then the other periods, starting from 1994, it's where we have a neoliberal democracy. This come in also just because of certain problems that Malawi was passing through. One of those issues was the strong presence of dictatorship, and it seems the atmosphere was ready for change, not only in Malawi, but Zambia and other nations as well. But also we had different economic difficulties. We can say that from the 1970s, things were better off in this country, but then when we are going towards the end of the 1970s, then problems started happening. For example, prices of tobacco were going down, but also we had the civil war in Mozambique, which was affecting the affairs in this country. So, but there was also this general wind that came because of the neoliberals, such as Margaret Thatcher, Reagan, but more especially the World Bank, the IMF, and other communities that were supporting African nations. These ones, they were already pushing for certain principles that are practically based on the idea of neoliberal thought. We can think of the Washington Consensus with its principles that were developed. These ones were somehow being forced in most of the African nations, because the main issue was, if you want to be supported, then you have to reform here. If you want to be supported, then you restructure here. So it was all the issue of restructuring everything so that the principles are in line with the neoliberal thought. Just to remind you, the neoliberal thought had certain important targets that it wanted to achieve. The fundamental ones was to promote individual freedom and market freedom. But behind all this, there was a certain philosophy that was targeting strong socialism that was targeting nationalism, because these were a threat to liberty as such. So some of the things that were behind everything, for example, the idea of having a minimum government, reducing the economic power of the government and so on, all these issues came together at once starting from 1980. So somehow the president, though he was a dictator, it was difficult for him to withstand the pressure coming from the people, but also coming from the donors who were asking him to reform. So we can say that the reform indeed happened. In the political context, we reformed from one-party system to multi-party system, but also the economic system continued to reform as well, from the Keynesian-based economy, where we had government control. The Malawi government was controlling in many areas. Then we embraced the free market, of course, with some resistance. So that's the background of the political landscape that we had. Up to now, we are still living this conflict between going forward with the neoliberal transformations and then the democratic socialism, which I've said it's also rooted somehow in the traditional culture here in our context. So this conflict continues in terms of values, economy, and many other issues. So we go immediately to look at the idea of the cooperation, which is my main concern in this presentation. Now, we can study the cooperation in Malawi. We can study it starting from the context of the democratic socialism. So we are talking about 1964 up to 1994. So here we have two ways of looking at the cooperation. We have the individualist conception that is coming from the Western world, of course, where we look at the cooperation as a legal person, as a corporate person, and so on. It's interesting to see our company law and most of these laws that we create. You can see that they are based on the Western or the British laws, how they were looking at these issues. Now, similarly, we had also another concept, the way we were looking at a cooperation. So we have the communitarian conception of a cooperation. So we are seeing it not only as a communitarian entity, but also we are saying that everything around the cooperation must be done towards the common good. So we can see that we have embraced from the beginning these two concepts, and these two concepts will be reflected in the structure of our cooperations in this period. We have what I will call community-oriented cooperations. We have also the private cooperations. The community-oriented cooperations, we had, for example, public state cooperations. I will just mention a number of them down here to show probably their relevance. So here we had some that were, we can say that they are public state corporations, but then we have some, they were not very clear. Where it's like something between the state and also probably some trustees somewhere and so on. So something not very clear, but associated with the government. Then we had the private corporations. We had a number of multinationals, most of them coming from Britain, United States of America, and South Africa. Now, these, after multinationals in the private sector, we had also large African corporations run by the residents, but also we can say that the citizens, some of the citizens, but these were very few in number. Now, the bigger group in the private sector, we had the small corporations, These ones, they were not really significant because they were doing really little things in the society and so on. Now, I will go and comment on the community-oriented corporations in democratic socialism. So the corporations were designed to lead the nation in key areas of development, such as in the context of industrial revolution. So the nation wanted at least to see that revolution as it happened in Britain and other areas. But also the area of agriculture was fundamental, import and export and so on. So what I wanted to say here is that the way these were organized, they targeted certain crucial areas in the context of development. Of course, I've said they were promoting the common good. So I think they were well planned, they were well thought of. For example, we had the Malawi Development Corporation, MDC. This one focused on the industrial revolution, but it was established by the act of the parliament. Similarly, we had the Agriculture Development and Marketing Corporation, where the focus was on agriculture. Just to say that the Agriculture Development Marketing Corporation supported the local farmers, even providing them with the equipment and so on, but also defended them in terms of market, because the ADMAG was buying crops from the poor farmers and then selling these at a higher market, where it was very difficult for these poor farmers at least to compete and have a say. So we had also other corporations such as Spearhead, which was also looking at agriculture, but these ones helped in different areas. And I still remember also in the context of transport, we had some corporations owned by the government, and the transport system was highly improved by then as compared to the changes that will follow. Now, the community-oriented corporations were a very big, we can say that it was a big side that was competing with the multinationals. Because on the private side, we had the multinationals, as I indicated earlier, most of them coming from Britain, USA, and South Africa. And they were focusing, for example, we just mentioned a number of them. We can look at the Eastern Produce Corporation that was in the context of agriculture. We can look at Ronlo, which was very famous for sugar up to now, and tea and coffee. We have African Lakes Company. This one is highly studied, which also involved in a number of things. Then the British Commonwealth Development Corporation also was involved in a number of areas, including the industrial, commercial sector. We had the Sterling Drug, Ronald also was involved there, Guthrie Group, Carlsberg Breweries. I think this one is from Denmark, and many more. BP also was involved in business starting from that period there where we were practicing democratic socialism. So you can already see that there's a big competition here between these corporations and the government corporations. The only thing is that given that of course the president was seen as a dictator, there was an advantage that was going towards the public corporations. Of course, this also helped individuals, as I've said, that it connected the masses, at least to the market and the other needs that these people wanted. Now, when we look at the large private African corporations, I just quoted from one of the US documents where they were saying there are a small number of citizen and permanent resident controlled large enterprises, mainly in agriculture, especially plantation agriculture and the tobacco. I just quoted it to underline the element that there were very few. They were just a small in numbers compared to the multinationals. This is already indicative of the scenario that we have in Malawi, or we had in that period, where the multinationals were making even more profits as compared to these other private sector corporations. More especially there, I was trying to underline the small business corporations. These ones, they had no exporting power, and they were only focusing on these daily or basic things that they do. Now, this is the situation that we see in terms of democratic socialism. Now, there's a change that is happening with the coming of neoliberal system. The neoliberal democracy, as I indicated, is in underlining individual and market liberalization. But we can see that one of the main targets, that is, the main targets is to reduce also the power of the government. So the government of Malawi, its power was also somehow coming from the public operations, because these were funding the government, although in some cases they were being funded by the government, where they were, for example, when there were some losses in these organizations, so the government was supporting them. So we have this neoliberal system coming in and targeting these corporations that, okay, we have to reform these corporations. But as we are reforming them, we are also minimizing the power of the government. I think we can all remember that the principal thinking is that if we empower people, the private, economically, then we are also going to affect the political power. We are going also to minimize the political power that was there. So one of the main tools that we used in Malawi to transform into this neoliberal context, we used more privatization of these public entities. So they were privatized, starting from some of them 1982, like the press group, but also the rest, like MDC 1984, and ADMAG, and many others. We transformed also the laws that were present, since some of them were favoring the community-based corporations that were run by the government and so on, and also the role of the government in the corporations, where it was controlling a number of things, that we try to remove that. Now, we have a new scenario where the country is changing in its understanding of the corporation, but also the functions. But then what happens is that the multinationals are given now more advantage, since the community-owned are being restructured and most of them are losing their power. So that is working somehow, because they will not have any more that mass of even supporting the government in its activities. But there are some negative elements also that will come to the people on the ground. I'm talking about the masses, the common people, more especially those who were looking at the community-centered corporations as fundamental. Or, for example, they were providing services, so they were still looking at them as important. Now, with the neoliberal system, we can say that each individual is on his own, even in terms of services and everything that is needed in the society, because these people now, they have to look at the multinationals, they have to look at the small private corporations, or these larger corporations that are few in number. That's where they have to look at when they want to get any service that they need. Now, this becomes complicated. Now, I just want to indicate some of the elements, we can say success, and what led also to the collapse, some of the elements that show the collapse of the corporation. Now, I will start with the success. When we go back to the area form of the cooperation, we see that indeed these corporations promoted investment. For example, MDC as a government corporation tried to promote these investments. It promoted the real estate, it promoted the industry, but also hotels and so on. So we're going to see something positive, the same with ADMAG. I think some of these things, I've mentioned them in passing when I was discussing above. But then there will be a number of failures in the whole system, in the whole democracy that was present in Malawi in terms of these corporations. I can say that one of the common evils that we have seen throughout these corporations, starting from the democratic, from the democratic socialism, we can see that there was somehow weak management because these positions, the high positions were somehow politicized, like the board members, the managers, and so on. Some of them were elected, were put there by the president, the political party, and so on. And some, they were not even experts in the area, and this affected how they behaved in those positions. For example, one of the areas that I've seen is where they were investing wrongly. So they could borrow money somewhere and then invest it in a wrong way. This type of tendency is also present in the remnants of these community-based corporations. We have recently seen issues in terms of post office, another corporation that is still under the state, but somehow revolutionized. But also we have seen that in ESCOM that supplies electricity where they have made wrong investments, and even the common people wondering that what was happening to those on top. So that is one of the problems that we have seen, but also the dependence on agriculture that was present in the, from 1964 to 1994, also led to this unstable situation in the corporations, because the moment we had no rain or the rains were not good, then it meant also a crisis. That crisis was affecting the whole nation. An example is ADMAC in 1968 when the crops were few, so ADMAC entered into crisis, and this also meant the whole nation, Malawi, was in crisis. Now, another important issue that I want to bring in is that we have also the public corporations that started also suffering in the neoliberal context. As I've said, everyone is on his own in the neoliberal context. We had certain evils that started coming in this context. We can say that some of them were interpreted as a consequence of the failure of neoliberal democracy itself. One of these big problems is the question of corruption. Now, when you look at the area corporations run by the government, these people were somehow afraid to be corrupt in those areas. Now, because they knew that the system couldn't allow them to do that, so they didn't want to tarnish their image. But now, its corruption has increased, because one of the factors is that the government has been weakened by the neoliberal system. Now, it can no longer lead the nation in terms of values and so on. In fact, the masses, we can say the individuals are there to defend even the minority rights that they think they are right. Now, this has affected the cooperation in many areas. We have seen that there is now a lot of bribery. We have seen this crony and the mafia capitalism. We have seen a lack of trust.
Professor Kanga,
Yes.
excuse me, 3 minutes left.
Yes, I'm concluding.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have seen all these problems that are coming in because of the neoliberal changes. at the moment where what is happening is that there's a bit of nostalgia that some people think that it's better that probably we bring back the state-based organization, I mean, state-based corporations the way they were in the past and so on and so forth. But also there's fear that when we go backwards, it means that also we'll compromise the element of liberty. Now, there are a number of suggestions that we need a kind of Renaissance philosophy, like a rebirth of Africa in a different way, so that we can rebuild again, more especially rebuild the trust, rebuild our communities, and at least solve this conflict that is there between the individual, the community, and so on. I conclude by indicating that probably one of the things that can help us is probably infusing some values in the neoliberal system that is running at the moment concurrently with the community's beliefs. In short, the community is still very strong in Malawi, but also neoliberalism as a system is also very strong in the government. So there is that type of conflict. Thank you very much. I hope I'm making sense what I'm trying to communicate to you. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for your profound presentation. Well, you gave us a different view on democracy in developing countries, very interesting and perhaps unexpected sometimes. Well, Professor Bowring, can we hear you? Do you hear me? We want to hear your very interesting and very promising presentation. A tale of three anti-democratic populism challenging in the EU. Unfortunately, he has obviously problems with internet connection. So we have got a lot of time with for discussion, for questions, for reflection. So let's start with the question first. With the questions. The first question is from Carla Eva. To everyone, as we can see, democracy is a very unstable political system. What is the main problem with this system? Is democracy pragmatically a pure utopia? Unfortunately, Professor Levin has left our seminar for another meeting, and well, who would like to ask for this question? Please, perhaps Professor Minakov.
Thank you, Svitlana. First of all, I would say that democracy is not a utopia, and it's not even a theory. It's a practice. It's a very long practice with very long history. In 2012, there was a marvelous collective research published with edited the Edinburgh History of Democracy, edited by Isaac and Stockwell, who tried to summarize the human experience of democracy, starting with prehistorical tribal societies to contemporary and even with the expose of future possibilities for democracy. So in a way, this book represents how in different cultures in different times, the controlled tried to establish control over the controllers. So in a way, this generic formula showed how in India or in China or in African societies, or in Europe, or in post-Soviet societies, there were institutions and institutes and organizations that provided political freedoms or control of the whatever we call demos at that culture or society over the rulers. So if we generalize democracy in certain way, then we can apply this, this principle to the history, non-utopian history of humankind. At the same time, if we talk about liberal democracy, it seems to be a very vulnerable temporary combination. Being left liberal myself, I must admit that liberal democracy is probably connected with several political, economic factors, cultural factors. So probably if you enjoy long peace, you are more inclined to establishment of liberal democracy. In societies that undergo more the military period, the conflict periods, then we end up with a source of of legitimation of non-democratic political practice. So that's very important. Also, Carla Eva is asking about instability, but politics itself is instability, whichever type of politics we take. I would refer to Aristotelian definition of politics as communication about the highest of the goods. So if we take this communication as contestation, as agonic situation, as dispute, that comes to the conclusions, then reconsiders, so this open communicative model of politics, then instability means something good. So unstable means living. Then it's a good situation. But this instability should be normalized in a way. If it's too liquid or too slow and too non-involving, too exclusive, then we have the situation of broken instability or vicious instability. So here we have this non-utopian practice of democracy, which is very long and connected to almost every culture in almost every society, and the instability is not necessarily a bad thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Buchirishvili, perhaps you would like to add something on this topic? Professor Buchirishvili?
Hello.
Hello. Perhaps you would like to add something to, on this topic?
First of all, this presentation was very interesting because I had very few information about what was going in Malawi. So it was first time I met someone from that part of the world.
Excuse me, the question is about democracy. Is democracy, what is the main problem of this system? Is it really unstable political system? Is it pragmatically a pure utopia or not? Perhaps you would like to add something to the Professor Minakov.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I thought I had to say a couple of words about the previous present. Yeah. Well, sorry. Yeah.
We will have possibility to reflect, to give our reflection on previous presentations and any presentation you would like to.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to say something about democracy, so please, or we can go to another question.
Yeah, it's better to go to another question because
Okay.
yes,
Okay.
communication is so poor. I can hardly hear you. That's why. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I'm coming closer to computer, but still, its communication is poor. I don't know. Today we have. It doesn't happen very often, but today we had cut of electricity and internet connection is very poor. So yeah, I can hardly hear you, but still I understand. Yeah.
I see. Professor Boring also has a problem,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Yes, I see.
So the next question is also to Professor Minakov. Well, we'll give you some rest and
excuse me.
Yeah, Svitlana, Professor Kyiv has a question.
Yes.
No, I just wanted to add to what was said before, just to say that I think democracy is very important and it's practical, but it just needs to be managed. So the problem with the democracy in most of the nations is that it is not properly managed because, for example, the element of freedom, we have to manage our freedom. Otherwise, we end up with the situation of corruption as it's a common norm these days in most of the nations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Wow. And let's start with the next question to Professor Kayange. Conflict between democratic socialism and neoliberal democracy. Do citizens have the capacity and tools to influence this conflict, or is it an intra-elite conflict? It is a question from Denis Kiryukhin. Please.
Hello, can you just repeat the other part? I didn't get you.
A question to Professor Kayange from Denis Kiryukhin. Conflict between democratic socialism and neoliberal democracy. Do citizens have the capacity and tools to influence this conflict? Or is it an intra-elite conflict?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. I think that for the citizens, most of them, they are coming from a cultural background where the community is important. So somehow they do influence this, but our society now is divided. We have many individuals that are pro the neoliberal ideologies. Most of them, they have studied in universities and different schools. So we have somehow a divided society where people, they can pull the other side where they support democratic socialism, but then there are some moments when they will also support the other side there. We have many examples. For example, if something happens that is against our cultural norms in the, I think the community side, then you find out that people will gang up to go against the neoliberal principles. A good example is where we had the homosexual problem, where two individuals, they contracted a marriage, a homosexual marriage. So you can see that the masses, the citizens, most of them, they went back to their cultural understanding of issues, and they were against some of the neoliberals who were pushing that this is freedom, it's liberty. We have to allow them do as they wish. So in short, I think the conflict is there and the people can influence, but depending on what they are benefiting from that type of problem that is there or the issue that is present.
Thank you for the answer. Well, the next question is to Professor Minakov from Denis Kiryukhin. According to Adam Przeworski, democracy is a civil war without the fight. This definition emphasizes the disagreement in society regarding basic values. On the other hand, democracy is impossible without communality. What unites people in a democratic divided society, or how democracy is possible in a divided society? So please, Professor Minakov.
Thank you, Svitlana, and thank you, Denise. Yeah, it's a famous saying of Przeworski, and I honestly disagree with this maxim. Democracy is not a civil war, it's a civil discussion that can reach the moments of war, even with clashes, with actual fight, or the moments of total agreement. Also, the both radical situations are rare. But again, the dynamics, political dynamics, is here in the full mass. So basically, the public sphere and public politics exists in democracy that is based on strong rules. So rules that are established by the citizens themselves and that follow these rules. Even if these rules seem to be very strange, like ostracism, right? Ostracism is institutionalized jealousy. Still, it's a democratic institution. I would also want to divorce democracy from something pleasant or good. Both good elements, good governance, good politics can exist in different forms, and necessarily democracy per se is something good. We can look at democratic regimes in Poland or Hungary and see that it's a very difficult, it's a difficult situations to see the good governance or the good politics there. Well, putting this aside and looking at the commonality issue. So if we look at democracy as communication of citizens, then this commonality issue should come from somewhere else. I would look at this in terms of the problem. What is first, the community or the political system? If this combination is very well studied, and we know from 20th century, if established state, an effective government is in place, then democracy, effective democracy that leads to good politics is possible. However, if we have situation like in post-Soviet societies, or in Southern Caucasus, or in Eastern Europe, that at the same time build economies based on the combination of public and private property, nation building and state building and democracy building, then we have a chaos that rarely brings the democratic result. So for example, in comparison of Belarusian and Ukrainian experience, there's this traditional division, nation building in Ukraine without state building, and state building without nation building in Belarus. And then we have situations when indigenous democracy ends up ineffective, because the state during the periods of more or less palpable political freedom cannot deliver to non-involved, marginalized groups, to the majorities of the population, which creates the problem and this demand for the strong hand, for the authoritarian option. And then when we have authoritarian option in a country like Ukraine, it does not deliver either. And then we have a tendency and demand for more freedom and more democracy, and which leads to just another Maidan and revolt. If we have a situation like in Belarus, we see that there was a very fast transition within 4 or 5 years from Soviet to neo-Sovietist regime, where state institutions like KGB, like very politically controlled police, were very fast reconstructed. And in this case, we see that attempts of democratization were always stopped by these effective government structures that showed their force even with the mass mobilization, like in the last year when we had hundreds of thousands of people protesting, but still the developed state, the effective government, non-democratic, autocratic government managed to limit the impact of the protest. That's my answer. And finally, you were asking if democracy is possible on divided society, in a divided society. Well, I think it's possible, but this combination of society versus state remains an issue. Is it cooperating or contradicting?
Okay, thank you. Denis, perhaps you want to argue? We cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
We have another questions in the chat, as I see.
Yes, but we have only 2 more questions for everyone, and I suppose we have a half an hour yet.
No, but we have a question about China's political system, for example.
Okay.
No. And then we will start maybe discussion.
Okay. Then the next question from Andrew Blasco to everyone. I frankly find it difficult to understand what democracy actually comprises. The definition appears to change in line with the strategic interests of a particular country or community. Who do I want to be my friend, particularly in alliance against an opposing power? Whose interests appear to align with mine? These tend to be the people whom I designate as democratic. Well, and it is a question to everyone. So I think another participant also can join to the discussion. Please, maybe who want to say some words on this topic? Please, be free.
If I could say a few more words.
Of course, please.
I'm sorry, I just interrupted Professor Minakov. So perhaps you want to speak before I comment on my own comment.
Well, if I can, I'd say that your comment is very much West-centric, because I also can look at China or Russia or Kazakhstan, who do not think that their friends, like friendly nations, are democracies, or they should be democracies. So democracy is positive, probably in the Western narratives or pro-Western narratives, while this conservative agenda that grows in many other nations and in the majority of nations today, this is probably not the case. But then this outside politics it remains an issue, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because we were discussing democracy as intra-political phenomena, how you reconstruct regime, political system, how politics functions within a nation or within a state. But if we bring it outside, then there is a new range of issues and questions and problems. That's my comment on your comment.
I was just I would say that the question I asked is, Western, as you said. My own perspective is not perhaps Western, but often, I live in a European country, right? I live inside the European Union, and often discussions of democracy, well, it indicates the nations in whom I am interested in having them change in a certain way, not necessarily for their own sakes, but for my sakes, for the sake of my interests. It's a moving target, and the way that target is defined depends on international issues. And when there are 2, 3 powerful blocks, groups of nations, and so on, we're talking about democratic development. Well, they're talking about the people that I would like to be like me, not necessarily for their own sake, but for mine, to support me, so to speak. And I don't want to say this in a cynical term. It makes me sad to say this, but I think that's often the case. So that was my motivation for asking.
Thank you. Perhaps anyone wants to answer something? Yeah?
Professor Kyiv wants to answer. You don't see his hand?
I'm sorry. Yes, I don't. Please, Professor Kyiv. Professor Kyiv, do you want to say something?
It's a false flag. Sorry for this. May I then add just a little thing?
Of course, please.
After Mr. Blasko was saying, well, there is some cynicism, level of cynicism in this international use or use of the word democracy in international relations. Currently, we can see how this union of democracies against the united autocracies is being built by Biden administration. And you can see that in our first part of the seminar today, there was a very good report about India and the state of democracy in India. And from scientific point of view, I would never call India a democracy, which is easily being done by the White House now. So here, there's definitely an issue of cynicism, but it's part of this toolkits of the West. So if we are allies, then we will give an advance. We will call our allies democratic states, even if they are not. That's my take on it. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go to the next question. The last but not least, very interesting question from Stavrola Gianni. I apologize, please, for my mispronunciation. The question for everyone, what is the role of the Chinese political system in the current and future world order? Is there anything we can learn from China's trajectory and its experimentation with social and economic systems? Very interesting question, and I propose to every participant to join the discussion, please.
if I could say a few words.
Of course, please.
Well, just to continue the same line that Professor Minakov and I have been talking about a bit. China today in the European Union, in North America, is spoken of as a non-democratic country precisely because we view it as an opponent. Whatever the elites might be interested in learning from China, they speak of China in terms of democracy, lack of human rights, and so on, in order to create an opposition, in order to create an opponent, indicating that we do not approve of them in some way. And I think it's unfortunate. You know, it's a very large country, obviously a country on the rise, will continue to be so for decades to come, but domestic populations are being prepared for certain kinds of foreign policy by being told, being reminded of the supposed fact, whether it's true or not, that they are not a democratic country and somehow don't belong in the same group as we do. And so, well, that's all it's a repeat of what I said before, but it's certainly a prominent example of what I had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Svitlana, may I?
Yes, of course, please.
I'm sorry to take much time, but I think there was no anyone willing to speak. I would
have
look.
Lots of time.
I would look at Chinese political experience in several perspectives. So first of all, we definitely see how the Western democracies are eager to share their model, to disperse their model in recent 30 to 40, 50 years. This part of the missionary, of the mission of democracy to spread the model. This missionary politics in Chinese case was connected to the period of Maoism. They tried to influence some of their neighboring nations, continuing the Leninist estafette, so bringing further the ideas of the Bolshevik revolutions. But this politics has finished quite a long time ago. Contemporary China is not missionary. It has its own political system, but there's no proof that it tries to disseminate this model further. But it can enlarge it. So what can be done is another part of China and Chinese political experience, which is non-communist politics. Taiwan, Hong Kong, some other cases were very specific, partly colonial, partly non-free, non-sovereign, but also some political experience of public politics, of more competitive politics, more economic and political freedoms. And this experience is more connected in the fusion of Chinese tradition and of Western models, especially after the World War II. And this type of experience shows that democracy is possible also in China. But the major resources and the biggest part of population lives in totally different political system where public politics is minimal. And it's streamlined within one major party, which in this party is not very strong institute that provides, for example, rotation of elites. We remember that in post-Mao period, there was a period of collective governance with every 10 years a change of leadership. And now this policy is dropped and there's one leader's policy again in place and party did not abstain. So in a way, the political system that exists in China is diverse, but still this major model seems to be reluctant for open public process, for example, public political process.
Since we're talking about China, I would like, as Chinese, I would like to join in. But I don't know Chinese situation well because I have been away for so long. But in case of a democracy, as Andrew was asking, what is democracy? If you will look at the term democracy, it means people's power. And if it's a people's power, and literally understanding the term, is any country purely has the power over people, exercising such a notion. So, in a sense, democracy is a project, and then now it became an ideology used by certain political groups. If democracy is an ideology, then just like a religion, people can interpret it in a different way. North Korea is a democracy, a democratic, republic, something, and the People's Republic of China, and so there's one model, and if you see America is democratic country. Democratic country in two principles. One is the equality and the freedom. And then you see the rich, the 1%, and then the rest. And this is the economic system, and this democratic political system. There's a tension. So I think we are still experimenting what is democracy in any country in the world, and no mature is still in process. And in China, as now they are talking about the Chinese is thinking there is one model of a democracy based on meritocracy. So you see, if you say it's a totalitarian democratic system, it's also a possibility. So what's the if we talk about democracy for democracy's sake, I think we have to think, what's the democracy for? For democracy itself, or for people to have a good life? I think that's all the systems try to work for. That's my little contribution. Thank you.
May I say?
Of course, please.
May I say something?
Yes, Professor Beliza. Yeah.
First of all, I apologize for my late joining to you because of my schedule of lectures and exams today. I joined you lately. It's my excuse. Please receive it. And my comment is about the concept of equality. Equality in America is a rather doubtful concept because, for example, equality in the sphere of religious leads to the crisis of religious life, to my mind. So we should be very careful when we speak about the equality. Equality has its own limits, as well as democracy also means that it is a limited theory, because democracy should consist in itself some anti-democratic points to limit itself. Because in absolute sense, if we consider democracy in absolute sense, this democracy can be turned into some aligned system of anti-democratic system. So my opinion is that every political system should be limited on its own limits and should consist some opposite points for its development. Thank you.
Thank you for comments. Very interesting. a very interesting and topic. Please, Denise.
Yes, I want to return to the question about China and democracy. I know Professor Kiryukhin knows this question better than me, but one short remark, because it's, as for me, it's very important. I agree with such definition of democracy from Amartya Sen or John Stuart Mill, that a democracy is a government by discussion, by a government through discussion. And from this point of view, China is not democracy, of course. But as for me, the Chinese political system is unique. And unlike, for example, political system of liberal political system of North America and or European democracies, the China political system cannot be exported to another countries. Our interest to China in this situation is because it's very interested alternative civilization, if I may say in such way, alternatives to the Western political system, and some elements of the democracies in China's political system present. I mean, several years ago, I saw the interesting book about China's deliberative democracy in China. So, political system, China's political system has on the low level, on the level of local communities, very developed deliberative system, and citizens to discuss the key questions of their everyday life, but not political questions. It's questions about economy, local economical questions, local social questions, so on, so on. I think that the Xi Jinping's policy, the main goal of this policy is the reconstruction of traditional China's social relationships, social traditional institutions with liberal market, with liberal economy. And in this way, for me, China is very, I repeat, very unique situation, and we can study it, but we cannot to reproduce the system in other countries. Thank you.
May I just add one point? I think democracy, we cannot just limit democracy to a political sphere. Democracy is a way of life. It includes everything. If we think of democracy, it's about participation in life, in living a good life. Because what's the basic principle for democracy? And I'm asking, everyone, what is the basic principle for democracy? For voting, only voting is a democracy? Oh, there's a basic principle, as I mentioned, freedom and equality. And between these two principles themselves, there's tension.
Well,
can I enter into the discussion?
Yes, of course. I would like only to make also some comments. I think that it depends on how we define democracy. According to Robert Dahl, the fundamental principles of democracy are those of political equality, popular sovereignty, and majority rule. And we must make a difference between democratic principles and liberal principles, components of liberal democracy, and put them, in liberal democracy, they are put together, but the fundamental difference thus persists between liberalism and democracy in the modern world, as liberalism is not a natural outgrowth of the process of democratization. Well, it's my short comment, please, Aisha Mukherjee.
Yeah, thank you so much for. I really apologize for being latecomer. Hello, Mamuka. Seeing you after ages,
nice
I suppose. Yeah,
nice
to see you.
Very
yeah,
nice.
Dennis. Yeah, very nice.
I've
been listening to the
young.
discussion.
You are
Sorry?
still young. You are still young.
Well, we are all getting old, so that's a natural process. You can't stop. But anyway, we are all young at any age, I would say. Yeah, so coming back to the discussion, it's a fascinating discussion which I've been following for the last 2 hours. But and I really appreciate Mikhail's interventions. I've been really enjoying. Regarding and also whose interventions, and I think the basic question which actually who has raised is, what is democracy? How do we understand democracy? And I mean, which is actually the foundation for democracy is equality and freedom. Now, and also the dignity of human being. The question is, how do we define these questions? I mean, if we go to the roots of equality, I mean, and the history of philosophy, equality for equals and unequality for unequals. There are two parts of it. There are two parts of equality. One is, I mean, the way we define equality. Aristotle has defined equality. Equality for equals and inequality for unequals. Now, these two parts, that is very important. So we have to keep that in mind. And then freedom. So actually, the equality, for example, our 5 fingers, none of them are equal. But then after all, they all belong to my hand. So I have to treat them equally. Our 2 eyes, they're not equal. Yet I have to treat them equally. So equality with difference, that's exactly the notion of equality. And the same is, I mean, so the contradiction actually is inbuilt in the concept of equality itself. Exactly the same way, freedom. Freedom is never absolute freedom. Freedom is within the limits. So that is also inbuilt in the concept of the freedom itself. Therefore, I think that to look for absolute democracy is also a misnomer. I mean, that would be a wrong way of looking at the problem itself. So there's no absolute definition of democracy. There's no absolute concept of democracy, either in the West and therefore, coming back to China, for example, the freedom to have deliberations, the dialogue, the debates, and restricting political field. I mean, which is a very interesting kind of democracy experiment, which is going on in China. You can question number of things, you can have a dialogue in number of things, but not on political issues. Now, as Mikhail also mentioned into this thing, but then this kind of democracy, I mean, freedom is not freedom for everything. You can't really question. I mean, surely it's one vote, no doubt, on the one hand, but after you voted, you can't really question. If you, again, who has said very rightly that there's a tension between, and also somebody was raising this issue, what the tension between the civil society. I mean, how do we carry the goals of the democracy? How the political system, within a political system, if the opposition is so much opposing everything, if they are given the freedom to oppose everything, the political system just cannot do anything. So welfare of the society, the welfare of, and the democracy is for the good of the people. And if it is for the good of the people, and no good can be realized because of the democratic fundamental presuppositions that you have the right to question everything, then no goal ever would be realized. So these are inbuilt contradictions within the concept of democracy itself. So and then the question of human dignity. Like, how do we give the human dignity? Just by questioning? Is this the way we provide the human dignity? We give the respect is this the only way to provide dignity to human beings? So I think these are the questions which we have to raise within the democracy itself. So there's no one model of democracy, because there's no one definition of equality. There's no one definition of freedom. There's no one definition of human dignity. And therefore, the flexibility and the contradictions and the inbuilt structure, that the dynamics, if I can use the word dynamics, the dynamics of democracy itself is extremely interesting, and we have to look into within the dynamics. So one side you have Indian democracy, on the other side you have US democracy, and then you also have the Chinese democracy. So these are different alternative models, and therefore perhaps we have to look for these different models, and each model, I would say, has one's own inbuilt contradictions, and also it has inbuilt a kind of lesson to be learned from each one of them. So there are good points and plus and minus both sides, and perhaps to look from that perspective. I think that's what I would like to suggest. Thank you so much.
If I could say a word.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course, please.
The issue, connecting democracy, connecting political freedom with issues of debate and deliberation and dialogue raises a host of very troubling issues because, well, public discussion is very, very easily manipulated. You put somebody in a room with 10 computers and a handful of robot Twitter accounts, and you can have thousands of people in the street in a matter of hours, right? The manipulation of public opinion, the manipulation of debate has been a lesson that was very hard learned. It was a hard learned lesson in Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s, right? You say a lie long enough and people believe it, it becomes true. You say it in English, you lie in English, it becomes even more true. And so it's not so easy to point to things of dialogue. There are standards of truth that are linked to languages. There are standards of truth that are linked to countries. And so talking about something, deliberating something, discussing something is no guarantee that there's any freedom in the room at all. I just wanted to make that reaction. There's not much time left to talk, but thanks for the opportunity to say a few words.
May I say something? May I?
Please. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Let me take an example from my investigations in philosophy of quantum physics. There is a very interesting experiment in quantum physics that when the quantum particle is free, it does not move in a chaotic manner. It moves to save the whole system of quantum particles. So the link of particles, freedom and responsibility for the other particles is the essential law of quantum physics. So that's, I think that shows that unity of freedom and responsibility is not belong to the human sphere. It is as quantum physics shows, it is a law of whole physical reality, whole nature, whole life. So it is my experience in investigations in quantum physics. So this link between responsibility and freedom, which I think it is a main principle of democracy, does not belong only to the human sphere. It is the law of whole world, whole reality in which we live. Thank you.
Mikhail, you would like to say some words? Very shortly, please.
dear colleagues, I think by relativizing the notion of democracy, making it a way of life or happiness or equality, it doesn't serve good neither to happiness, nor to good way of life, nor to democracy. Democracy is something which is form of governance, so it's even narrower than just politics. It's not private life, it's not physics. It's some form of governance, and there are many different forms of governance. And this form of governance is measurable. It can be measured, and we can say, here we have democracy in that element, of that element, or this element. There are also different forms of democracy, liberal, illiberal, and so on and so on. So, but it's very key to remember that it's something existing, it's something measurable, and it's not relative. So please, let's don't mix terms, concepts, and something that is measurable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for everybody, for everyone. It is 4:30, and we are out of time. I'm really excited to meet you all today here, and many thanks to the speakers for all the speakers, for interesting and actual and very profound presentation, and many thanks to all participants for questions and comments and vivid discussion. We had really vivid good discussion. I really enjoyed our conversation. And now we start our last section, a concluding session. Now, Jose Zanova, please. You are the next speaker, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Greetings to everybody. First, let me apologize for not having been able to participate in your conference. From the last 15 minutes I heard, it was a lively debate. I think there are lots of issues. Unfortunately, because of the time difference, and I'm an old man, I cannot spend the night basically having discussions as I used to have when I was young. But the conversation, the debate reminds me of my experience 30 years ago, 35, when I began coming to Ukraine regularly. I came with the Democracy Seminar. The Democracy Seminar was an institution that we started, the New School for Social Research in New York, a famous university, in conversation with dissident intellectuals in Poland, like Adam Michnik, in Jacek Kuron, and in Slovakia, in Hungary, all of them precisely working towards the establishment of democracies in post-Soviet societies. I had a particular interest in Ukraine, so I arrived in 1990 with the invitation of the Journal of Philosophical and Sociological Thought to begin discussing and to try to incorporate intellectuals in Ukraine together with our seminars, where we're meeting people in New York, people in Poland, Hungary, through exchanging papers during the year. And then once a year, you would meet either in Poland or in Slovakia or in Hungary, that were the places where one could already meet in the late 80s. For me, it became a fascinating experience because I realized that Ukraine was going or trying to establish 4 fundamental different institutional structures: a state making, for the first time establishing a new state in Ukraine; nation building, to build a new nation in Ukraine; civil society, to establish a free, democratic, tolerant society; and market reform, a market society. For me, it was fascinating as a sociologist to see how these 4 dynamics were clashing with one another at everything that was happening in Ukraine. After 7-8 years of coming every year to Ukraine, I realized that I could leave the project of studying this process aside, come back 30-40 years later, like today, and the process is still unfinished. In Ukraine, we're still building a state, we're still building a nation, we're still building a civil society, we're still building democracy. However, despite the difficulties of the task, I became optimist. I became an optimist observer of the process for two experiences I had in my first visit to Ukraine. The first was the experience of bilingualism. I was used from the Ukrainian diaspora to think that you could not be a Ukrainian and speak Russian. And yet I met many intellectuals that were Ukrainian citizens, namely wanted to be free citizens of a democratic, independent Ukraine that were speaking Russian. And for the first time, they had to try to speak Ukrainian with me because I spoke Ukrainian, I did not speak Russian. So I became aware of bilingualism in Ukraine, not as a cleavage that cannot be surmounted, but a way of tolerating differences in public life. And this became evident in Maidan when people began switching back and forth between Ukraine and Russia without any difficulty. So the notion that there will be a civil war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine simply was not credible to me. If one look at Donetsk and Lviv, yes, but the center holds the two extremes together. And most Ukrainians are simply tolerant bilingual speakers. Second was religious pluralism. I came to establish to the first conference in '92 when the Constitution was being prepared for the article on religious freedom, on state church separation. And I met for the first time representatives of every religion in Ukraine, Greek Catholics, Orthodox, Roman Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Baptists. All of them took part in this conference, and all of them could talk to one another and wanted to have a free Ukraine where all the religions were respected. And this has been the experience. Ukraine is the only country in Europe that has an association of religious organizations. All the religious organizations in Ukraine belong together. The chairmanship of the association changes every 6 months. So today maybe the Jewish community that is the presidency, next time maybe the Muslims, in a year maybe Orthodox, etc. This is a unique experience. So in 1997, I wrote an essay, Ethno-Linguistic and Religious Pluralism in Ukraine, where I challenged the thesis that civil war was inevitable in Ukraine. In Spain, yes, but not in Ukraine, I'm sorry. Spain is my country of origin. And I realized also because I was, as a sociologist, I was reading the public opinion polls, and I saw the difference between what political elites were doing and ordinary Ukrainians. So what I can say is that the glass is either half full or half empty. I prefer to see it half full. Mikhail Minakov has, I think, eloquently spoken of the need to make analytical distinctions between democracy, a form of government, a free society. There are many different aspects of it, but let's concentrate on how to build democratic structures of governance, which are accountable, which are, of course, elections are not the only thing, participation. And in Ukraine, the most important where democracy is really alive is at the local level. You have to go to the local level, to the municipals, where you see democracy really active, where the oligarchs do not control the processes, neither of decision-making nor of political reforms, and there is political participation. So if you look at if you go at the local level is where you see this. Unfortunately, there is a chasm between political society and civil society, and especially at the level of parliament, of government, the inability to really establish functioning political parties responsible to the people, not basically controlled by oligarchs, and the ability to create precisely responsible links. Sorry, another Ukrainian, famous Ukrainian pianist was calling me, Blodko Venetsky, sorry. So it is this experience that has given me, if you wish, a certain optimism. The fact that first came the mobilization against Kuchma, then came the Yellow Revolution, then came Maidan, and then came even the surprising change, people trying to find through electoral election of this crazy president, maybe you can change things. We try everything else. And today, again, even the president of Zelensky can be seen either half full or half empty. I recommend all of you to look at the book edited by Mikhail Minakov, From the Ukraine to Ukraine, where all these political processes of the last 30 years are analyzed in detail with great also depth. So again, I wanted to offer my personal experience. At the time, I was together with my colleagues at the New School and some intellectuals in Eastern Europe. We began well before Juan Linz and Alfred Stepan and others began comparing transition to democracy in Southern Europe, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. We began doing so, and my interest was to link the transformation of Ukraine to other Eastern European transformations. Obviously, today, Ukraine still stands in between Europe and Russia, and still has tremendous difficulties. You must understand, if you have a big power that doesn't recognize your right to exist, then of course, to create a free society, a political system under those conditions is very difficult. And then you are caught up in geopolitical conflicts. So this makes the process geopolitically even more difficult. So and yet, despite all these difficulties, I am hopeful of the way the transition, the long transition to a democratic form of government, to an independent state, an autonomous, relatively society, and to a tolerant, pluralist, and free society is taking place in Ukraine. So with this, I finish my reflections.
Many thanks for your reflections. And now, please, Hu Yuping, would you like to
just a few words, Jose, just because of you was not showing up, that's why I threw out these questions to stir people to join the discussion. But I just want to thank, on behalf of Council for Research in Values and Philosophy, to thank Dennis and Svitlana for their initiative and for the Paulo, the Sociology Department, to host
dear Hu, we cannot hear you properly.
You can't hear me?
Not good.
And
not
also put the camera closer to your face so that we can see you also.
My camera. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
We can see you now. Also, turn maybe the camera a little lower.
Oh, I'm a technical.
We want to see your pretty face, yapping.
So now you can see me, huh? Oh, but I have used my hand to hold this camera. I just want to thank all the speakers and for sharing their insight and also very insightful presentations, and all the discussions, the questions, very interesting and also exciting. And I can see many old friends, old colleagues on the screen, and also from the morning, and also new friends. So I hope I'm this a long day for you, a long night for me, since last night, midnight till now. But I was enriching and worth spending the whole night. And I hope we can continue our discussion. This is the ongoing project, as I mentioned before. It's political or whatever. But in Chinese thinking, yin and yang never divided. If you divide life from politics, life from economics, it's not life. So we think in a holistic term. So then that's why you know, if you ask what does that mean, one monk asked the master, what is the wisdom? The monk just smiled, no, nothing, and they didn't say anything. Silence. So then that's we have to meditate what wisdom is. So that's the Eastern way of thinking. And now how can we enrich each other? And then I hope we can continue our discussion. And if you have any suggestions, ideas, please send to us. And thank Jose for the support. And I wish everyone, you know, today is a holiday here in the US. It's a Memorial Day. And thank you for coming all and sharing us, and take care and be well at this difficult time. And that's it. See you next time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank
all.
you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Привіт, Mikhail. Михайло, привіт.
Вітаю, Jose.
Привіт, Павло. І Світлана, привіт.
Thank you.
Вітаю.
Вітаю, радий бачити.
Вітаю також. Вітаю всім.
I'm so excited to see my old friends and also new friends. Thank you.
Yeah, Mamuka, it is such a pleasure to see you after such a long time. And also
Long
to
time,
Dennis.
because of pandemic and so on. Many obstacles in my life.
Yeah, well,
Scientific
obstacles are always there, but we have to overcome all the obstacles as well, you know. So that is life, you know. So good to see all the old friends who and
But result is that I come back.
yeah, sure.
I come back to you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
please.
All.
Yeah. Thank
Keep
you,
in touch.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Keep in touch.
Yeah.
Thank
keep
you,
in touch.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Really enjoyed. Thanks.
All the best, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for everyone.
Yeah, thanks for pulling this off. Fantastic event. Really enjoyed all the presentations and discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you.